Hello, this is Robert Rickover at Body Learning, and today my guest is Dushka Hatton, who is an Alexander Technique teacher in London, England. She's been teaching for about 15 years, but we're going to talk today about her initial encounter with the Alexander Technique before she ever became a teacher. Dushka, welcome to the show.
Hi, Robert, and thank you so much for inviting me.
Well, it's a pleasure to talk to you. We've been in touch by email and various web projects for the last little while.
Yes.
I wonder if you could, if we could begin by you just giving your very short description or definition of the Alexander Technique.
Right. Well, I often say to people that the Alexander Technique quite simply says that the way that we use our body affects how it works, or to put it another way, that use affects function. And it's not a treatment as such, but really a series of lessons that enables you to explore how your body and mind work together. And as far as I'm concerned, it's been an instruction manual for life for me.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Well, that kind of leads us right into your story. You had written a blog. Uh, I believe the title was something like "How the Alexander Technique Saved My Life." Is that correct?
yeah, no,
And,
that's exactly it.
and it was a pretty compelling story. I wonder if you could kind of start at the beginning and proceed, and if there's anything I might jump in and help clarify something if need be.
Okay.
But basically, I think the story kind of stands on its own. So,
Okay. Well, I guess it started around when I was in my mid-30s. I found myself, I was very happily married. I had two beautiful young children. And I found that I was completely depressed. I had no energy for life. I had no enthusiasm. I had no zest at all for life. Um, we were going through a pretty stressful situation in our work life. I work with my husband, who's an architect, um, and we'd also just were in the process of building a house. So all in all, it was quite a stressful time. But I didn't recognize the symptoms of depression because, as I say, I was very happily married. I had two children. Apart from a couple, the external things, there was nothing really that I could see that was wrong with me. But I started losing a lot of weight. I couldn't sleep at all. And I think I even say in my blog that I was wandering around the house at sort of 2 and 3 o'clock in the morning, really with thoughts racing through my head, not knowing what to do with it. And this situation went on for, I suppose, a couple of years, really. Obviously getting worse and worse. So it was a very difficult time for the family. So I set my goals on trying to find out what was wrong with me. And my first point of call was my doctor. And he just said, well, would you like to go on Prozac? And I
hmm
hadn't really heard of Prozac in those days. So I thought, okay, well, if this is going to help, yes, I'll go on Prozac. And it really didn't help at all. It was horrible going on Prozac because it felt like I was shaking and I still couldn't sleep. And it made the situation, it seemed to me, a whole lot worse. So I then began this search to find out what on earth was wrong. And I think I saw various dietary people. I thought maybe I have a food allergy. We all have food allergies nowadays.
hmm
So I had testing of various things, and of course they said no, don't eat wheat, don't eat dairy, don't drink alcohol, don't drink coffee. So I stopped all those things. Nothing really much different. Um, I think I even saw I did see a psychotherapist, and we spent quite a lot of time drawing pictures which looked like bits of pizza as far as I can remember. So that wasn't much
Right.
that wasn't much help either.
Right.
Um, and eventually, after quite a few months of trying this and trying that, a friend of mine suggested that I go see an Alexander teacher she'd been to. So I thought, well, hey, why not? I've seen lots of other things. And I went to see her, and she was a remarkable woman. And in fact, I still go see her. I saw her yesterday, so I still go have lessons with her. And it took, I think I felt, I don't know what I felt those first lessons. It was very strange. It was very quiet. She didn't do much talking. She just let me be. We did some chair work, and then we lay on the table, or I lay on the table, obviously. And she did what I now know to be, the Alexander table work.
And can we just pause for a second to
please
explain to our listeners what chair work is? It's kind of an Alexander technique teaching procedure where the student is sitting in a chair and maybe at some point stands up or sits down, but it's not really about learning how to stand up or sit down. It's just a framework for a teacher to work with a student's thinking and movement patterns, that kind of thing. Would that be a description that would match yours?
I would say exactly that. We would look to see how we perform a familiar activity.
Which would be standing and sitting.
Which in this case would be standing.
Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And table work, which you also mentioned, is also another Alexander teaching procedure where the student is lying on a table, typically a massage table or a fairly firm surface, and in a particular configuration, knees elevated relative to your hips and some support under your head. It's kind of it's a position that encourages release in and of itself, and it's a great framework within which a teacher can work to help a student release tension. So it's a procedure. It's a teaching procedure, basically.
Exactly right. Exactly right. So I had what I now know to be standard Alexander lessons, and I think I continued these lessons for about I should think it was almost about 6 months before I realized that there was anything. Before I realized the value of what was happening. I would leave the lesson, and I would feel lighter in myself. I would feel less like I had the cares of the world on my shoulders. And this sensation would last for, I don't know, a few days, maybe. Well, a few days towards the end, but I couldn't really understand what was happening. And it was
but you did know something was happening.
Well, I think this is it. What was interesting was that my body knew. My body knew that it needed this. Something made me continue with these lessons.
Right.
It was as if someone had thrown me a lifeline, actually. And I think it was again a chance remark to. I think it was my mother-in-law, in fact, who said, "Oh, you seem to be so much better." And I said, well, yes, it's these Alexander lessons that are really helping me. And she looked at me and she said, well, why don't you train to be a teacher? And at that minute, it was as if I thought, I could do this? And so started a magical period of my life, which was to train to be an Alexander technique teacher.
Which we should say here is it's a 3-year process, pretty intense.
Very intense.
Typically daily, 3 hours or 4 hours a day. It's kind of Alexander lessons on steroids, really. I mean, you're getting a lot of work yourself, and of course you're learning how to teach, which really involves using yourself well and developing some specialized skills. So it's a pretty intense process, that 3 years of Alexander training.
Yes, it's an incredibly intense process, but it was, and I still look on it as a gift, really as a gift, to be able to spend that time learning how to live, essentially. Um, and we learn how our minds and bodies work in the, in the most precise way. I would,
And practical,
and practical.
extremely practical.
And
Yeah.
and this is the wonderful thing about this technique is that I think almost unique in any therapy or technique that I've come across, it manages to bridge both the our mental lives and our physical lives, and also by necessity our emotional lives.
Hmm.
And I think that's what I meant by giving us a blueprint for living,
Hmm.
in that it asks us how we perform very, very well any task. It could be simple, it could be complicated.
Hmm.
It asks us how we perform tasks, and it shows us with very simple and very practical ways methods to use ourselves, our whole selves, in the most efficient way possible. So, as I said, I used to skip off to my Alexander classes every morning with and just it was a real sense of joy.
I
Um,
think back on my training, which was about 30 years
ah,
ago, in London also, and I have to say it was one of the most exciting, interesting uh, 3 years of my life. It was just an amazing experience to be able to every day go and experiment with these ideas in a really supportive setting, and constantly discovering new things about myself and about how to teach this work. It's
and well,
yeah.
yes, I completely agree. It was. I mean, we hear a lot nowadays about this buzzword mindfulness, how we can attend to ourselves and how we can attend to the moment. And for me, the Alexander technique gives us very simple and very practical methods of doing exactly that. So right now I'm aware of how I'm sitting. I'm aware that I'm talking to you. Well, obviously I'm aware I'm talking to you, but and most people would, but I know that my feet are on the ground. I know that my back is back. All of these things. So in everyday life, it gives us tools to be able to use ourselves, as I say, to the maximum efficiency.
Right. You develop a sensitivity to yourself that enables you to very quickly assess what's going on and to make changes if you wish. I mean, it
I
gives you
th-
that freedom to change your current situation.
I think that's exactly right. It gives us complete freedom to do that, and the magical thing is that it's it works on every single level.
Hmm.
Again, which I find very exciting about this technique, in that I don't know about you, but I sometimes feel myself slipping into very similar thought processes or emotional patterning about something. Someone says some particular phrase, and you think, and you feel yourself say, "Oh, hang on, I don't like this," or whatever, and you fall into a pattern of habit in your expressions, in your thoughts, in your
Hmm.
emotions. And the
And
technique,
yeah, the technique can help you be aware of exactly what those habits are, and
indeed,
at a physical level, if nothing else, and how to shift them. Yeah,
exactly right.
yeah. You
Exactly.
in your blog, I just want to read a sentence from your
Right.
blog, which is a quote from a book that I'm not actually familiar with, Job's Body, I believe.
Ah, yes.
Dean Yuhan, is that the
Well,
author? Or Joe?
I think it is. I think he's an American
Hmm.
writer, so I think it's Juhan. Yes, I
Doohan,
don't know.
perhaps. Anyway, this quote is, I think, a very interesting one. He says, "There are no sensations or emotion that is not translated into a muscular response of some kind." And there, he goes on from there. But I think that's a key point, and something that when you have some experience with the Alexander technique, you really get that it's impossible really to have a thought of any kind without there being a muscular correlate.
I completely agree.
And
And I,
that is, I think that's kind of shocking for some people to hear who
mm,
haven't had the experience. I mean, I think a lot of people tend to think, well, there's thoughts and then there's actions. But one of the things you discover with the Alexander technique is it's really impossible to to separate them. And actually, Alexander himself, the guy who developed this work, 120 odd years ago now, I guess, um, he he was confronted with this fact from his own experience. He didn't come into his project thinking that ahead of time, but he was sort of forced to that conclusion that mind and body are really just two sides of the same coin. They're absolutely interrelated, and this was at a time when the idea of mind-body unity was pretty was definitely not out there all that much in the West. But
yes.
one does discover that fairly quickly when you start taking Alexander lessons, that it just, you cannot separate the two.
Well, I think that's exactly right. And well, as you know, and all of us teachers know, Alexander described humans as a psychophysical organism,
Hmm.
and that's exactly right. There is no emotion that isn't translated physically. And I'm often asking my students for example, the emotion of excitement is very similar to the emotion of dread, but
Hmm.
it's simply the mind that translates those same symptoms into either something positive or something negative.
Exactly.
Um,
Yeah.
so,
Yeah.
and
It,
I think that's why in my blog I suggest that people think of something annoying or irritating, and then notice their physical reactions to it, and perhaps then think of something that makes them feel happy, or
mhm.
that they're. And if you start noticing your physical reactions, you start proving more and more Alexander's initial discoveries on this point.
Exactly. And just to get back to your original reason for taking lessons, after your lessons and 3 years of Alexander technique training, what happened to the those initial symptoms?
Oh, yes. Well, I discovered that actually a lot of the symptoms were what I was doing to myself.
Hmm.
Rather like Alexander's discovery, I discovered that I was tightening my neck to a very, very great degree,
Hmm.
constricting my breathing, and collapsing in my upper torso. In short, all of the very familiar postures or positions that I guess a lot of us see with depressed patients, perhaps, or
Hmm.
depressed pupils. And I think the revelation for me for the Alexander technique was that it's not going to do anything about external problems, and nothing can, but it gives you such great tools to be able to look at how you are dealing with your problems, how you are dealing with external stimulus,
Hmm.
or even internal stimuli.
You know,
And
it's not for nothing that depression is called depression.
quite,
It is literally most people who are. I mean, if you look at someone and you think, "Boy, they look depressed," what is it that you see? You typically see a kind of an inward pull, often manifesting as kind of a slumpy posture.
yeah.
You know, I mean, it could be to take different forms, but it depression is pulling into yourself,
Well,
physically pulling into yourself.
exactly.
Yeah.
And pulling in and pulling down, and well, each one of us has different habits, but yes, exactly right. And we can all recognize that as such, and we only have to look at our actors to see if they're trying to portray a depressed person, that's what they'll do.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah.
Um, and it was exciting to discover that we don't have to necessarily deal with mental issues on a mental plane. We can simply ask a shoulder to release, and just by doing that, we find ourselves in a different situation.
Hmm. So
And
I think it might be important here to just emphasize that the Alexander technique is not a therapy per se. It is a teaching method. But of course, if you're releasing inward and downward pulls, that can have some or restrictions. That can have some really useful therapeutic spin-offs. But I think it's important that we be clear that we're not therapists and we
well,
don't diagnose disease or any of that sort of thing.
no, we really don't do that. But what we do, which is, I think, one of the most useful things that we can do for somebody, is that we give our pupils tools that they can start taking control and responsibility over their own lives. And to use another sort of fashionable buzzword, I would say that it's very empowering. And again, I
Very
think
empowering, yes. It
that
gives
was an
you a choice. It gives you a choice where you really didn't have one before
exact,
because you didn't actually realize what the situation was that you
exactly
would
right.
want to choose to change. I mean, you knew, obviously, you realized that you were, quote, depressed, but at some point, but you didn't really, I'm guessing, see exactly how that played out in your body.
I had no idea at all. I had absolutely no idea. The idea of me doing some form of body work couldn't have been further from my mind, really,
Yeah,
or my background or anything.
yeah.
So, and I think, as I say in my blog, but I often say that learning the Alexander technique was for me like learning to see in color. It was after having seen in black and white the rest of my life. It simply gave me a completely new set of sensations, a new sensitivity, and a new way of living, really, on a day to day level. It was very exciting. It
Well,
still is, actually.
yeah, it that your experience of not of knowing concretely what was going on in yourself before having lessons mirrors my own pretty precisely. I had absolutely no body awareness at all,
Right.
and it was quite a shock to me when someone once said, "Oh, your chest is pretty tight," and I remember
Oh,
thinking, "What does that mean?" It seemed fine to
yeah.
me. Anyway, is there anything else you want to mention before we come to an end here?
No, I think that we've really just about covered it. I think that's about it.
I
Yeah,
actually would like to end with you had mentioned just a little while ago that taking lessons was like seeing in color after
yeah,
seeing in black and white earlier. And I'd
yeah.
like to just read very quickly what you wrote right after that because I think it's a really interesting point and might
Okay.
be a nice place to end. You write, there is no right position or posture. There is simply a condition of simplicity and freedom. It demands your attention. It is so simple that it can be explained to a child, and yet, after 20 years of immersion, I am still learning and discovering. I think that's
Yeah.
a nice place to end our conversation. Um, my guest today has been Dushka Hatton, who is an Alexander Technique teacher in London, England. If anything that we've talked about today intrigues you and you live in London or that area, we'll put a link to her website by the interview. And if you live anywhere else in the world, we'll put a link to a site that will give you more information about the Alexander Technique and enable you to find a teacher in your area. Dushka, thank you so much for being on the show.
Well, thank you very much, Robert. I very much enjoyed it. Thank you.